This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Steadman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
Good, man. We've been podcasting fools lately. I feel like every day we're on this platform recording or meeting with folks. And I mean, I love it. Don't get me wrong. But yeah, spending a lot of time with you lately, Jeff.
Well, the key word there is fool. That's for sure. A couple of fools doing this. No, I mean, I think this is how we start the year. We end the year. It's like this mad rush to kind of get stuff in place before you and I disappear for a couple of weeks of, well-earned time off and then trying to hit the ground running and then, all that stuff. But I'll highlight the word again, fools. That's what we are.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I always like to do is like watch your background. So we're an audio only podcast, but Jeff has the coolest background at home with his, I guess, office or studio. You've got like a TV set up and you've got, I think it's like screensavers running on it, but always very cool. Today you're at a hotel. Your background is the hotel door and they've got the fire escape placard. And usually on that placard is what the nightly rate is if you don't have a discount code or something like that. And it's like Comfort Inn, $450 a night.
Yeah, today's show coming to live from a residence inn in Plymouth, Minnesota, up in the frozen tundra. And I believe the rate, kind of hard for me to see from here, is like $349 a night, which actually isn't too bad. I've seen absolutely ridiculous hotel rates in the cities and things like that where you're into four digits for sure.
Yeah. I bet it's cold there now. It's only going to get colder, though.
Yeah, not so bad. 27 degrees. Those are rookie numbers. We don't really pump those up, right? You want those lower, I guess, in this case, but not too cold yet. Going to go out and hit some Topgolf tonight. Yes, in freezing weather. I'm curious to see how it's going to work. I believe we have heat, fans that should be running, so hopefully that'll be a good time. I'm actually going out to meet our friend Tom Sheffield, who's been on this show
From
tonight.
Target.
So that'll be good times. Yeah, from Target.
That would explain the Minnesota piece.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. No, he's a good guy, man. I'd love to have him back on the show.
Yes. Maybe we'll make a wager on golf tonight or something if whoever wins convince him to come back on.
If he loses, he has to come back on the show. What does that tell you about the show, Jeff?
It doesn't tell me anything. How about that? Actually, he and I were talking at Authenticate last year, and he's working on his new sort of presentation for this year. So I think last time I talked, I was like, hey, once you come on the show and kind of work it out, once you've got sort of the framework in place and, go from there. So Tom, if you're listening, looking forward to get you back on here and looking forward to seeing you tonight.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited about today's episode. This is a long time coming, and I'm really honored to have this guest on our show. You want to go ahead and do your normal introduction?
Yeah, let's get Phil Windley on the line here. He's a senior software development manager at AWS Identity. He's also a co-founder and organizer of the Internet Identity Workshop. Welcome to the show, Phil.
Hey, thanks. It's great to be here. I've listened to a number of episodes, and I'm excited to be a guest.
Yeah, well, thanks for taking the time here and joining us. I know you're a very busy guy. You got a lot of different, identity frying pans on the stove that you're probably cooking with. One of the things that we like to figure out, though, is how people get into this world of identity. How did you get into the identity and access management space? Is it something that you chose, or did it choose you?
In the early 2000s, 2001, 2002, I was the CIO for the state of Utah under Governor Mike Lovett. And when I was done doing that and was doing some consulting, a friend of mine, Doug Kay, had written a book on web services. And I thought that was kind of cool. So I was just talking to him about, hey, how'd you write a book? What'd you do? And he said, well, you should write a book on digital identity. The world needs one. And I said, Doug, I don't know anything about digital identity. And he said, no, you do. Just think about everything you did as CIO, and it's probably digital identity. And as I thought about it, sure enough, he was right. I ended up writing a book that was published in 2005 called Digital Identity from O'Reilly. And if you know anything about 2005, it was a little bit of a watershed year in identity. It's when, first of all, Web 2.0 was a big thing. People were worried about how do we get access to APIs for, everybody's stuff. Before that, the world had primarily been kind of centralized identity systems. I'd built them, right? Organizations ran, directories or whatever in order to manage their identities. But so the book is primarily about that. It's primarily about this kind of centralized directory-based identity. How do you do that? But the world changed in 2005, and people started talking about identity in different ways. And because I was writing a book, I got included on lots of interesting conversations. In December 31st, New Year's Eve, 2004, Steve Gilmore, who is, something of a legend in podcasting circles, he was doing a good Gilmore Gang, and he's still doing Gilmore Gang 20 years later. He did this thing that people came to call the Identity Gang. So it was he had like 30 people on. And, as podcast host, you can probably imagine the sheer just, cacophony.
It brings terror to my ears just thinking about
30 guests on a single podcast, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, it was all about identity. And after that was over, Doc Searles, who was also on it, and I were talking, and we were saying, the world needs a conference to talk about this kind of new user-centric identity vibe, what people are doing. I don't think we said vibe in 2004, but that was the idea. And so we decided that we wanted to do a conference. And so we set out to do something called Internet Identity Workshop. We failed. We went to have the first one in the spring of 2005, just couldn't get it together, just wasn't working. But we were still interested, still trying to figure it out. Doc ran into a woman named Clea Young at a Giants game. They were both there as part of some conference. I don't know what conference it was. And they started talking, and Doc was mentioning that, we ought to do this. We want to do this workshop. And she said, I could help you with that. And that was kind of the little bit of extra magic sauce that it took to actually get it off the ground. So we had the first Internet Identity Workshop in the fall of 2005 at the Hillside Club in Berkeley, California. About 70 people there. And what we did was we pulled together people who were doing what was URI-based identifiers. And there were 4 of them. There was Dick Hart was doing something called SKIP. Johannes Ernst was doing something called LID. Drummond Reed had something called XRI. And the folks at LiveJournal, David Ricardon and Brad Fitzpatrick, were doing something called OpenID. And we thought, hey, this will solve the identity problem. Let's get all these folks together. We'll figure out how to create a single protocol for URI-based identifiers. And then we can all go off and do the other things we want to do that are not identity. And of course, as you guys know, we just held the 37th Internet Identity Workshop last October. So we didn't go off and do other things. We just kept doing identity over and over and over again. And so I've been doing that, since then. Digital identity's kind of been my thing. Just wrote another book for O'Reilly called Learning Digital Identity. And so that's how I got into and kind of have been growing through digital identity over the years.
And Jim has been probably showing that book off on the camera here whenever he possibly gets the chance. So I think you said 37 different IIWs so far?
Yeah.
And this was in 2005. The numbers don't add up unless you're doing more than one per year. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
so
we
that's
do
what
twice a year. Once in the spring, once in the fall.
Gotcha. So I've never been to an IAW. Who is this conference for? I guess, what do people get out of it? Is it a bunch of big brain identity people? Can I go as a noob in the identity world? Like, what's the
So any given IIW, I think it's probably about 60% people who've been there before and about 40% who are new coming for the first time. And so no, you don't have to necessarily be, part of the identirati, as people sometimes call it. But who is the conference for? It's for whatever you want to do, because IIW uses what we call open space technology. Basically, it's an unconference. So you can come and talk about literally anything you want. If you want to have a session on the best guitar chords for singing Christmas songs, you're welcome to come to IIW and talk about that. And whoever's interested in the best guitar chords for Christmas songs will come and to your session. But what do the sessions primarily focus on? They primarily have focused on things like protocols, solving new identity problems, product, how do we get adoption for these new protocols? How do we make things work? So I mentioned that we brought the first group together to kind of do these URL-based identifiers, and they all became OpenID, right? So OpenID, as we know it, is not the original LiveJournal OpenID. They lent the name and some of their ideas. Skip, XRI, Lid, all lent ideas to the whole thing. Other people lent ideas. And the first version, V1 of the OpenID specification, was kind of what came out of that. That happened at IIW. OAuth is an outgrowth of IIW. UMA, OpenID V2, or OpenID Connect. Now, IIW is not the only place people have worked on these, but that's what people do, right? Is they come to IIW and have sessions on solving this particular problem, right? You'll have sessions on SCIM and IGA. I mean, you name an identity topic or protocol, and people will be hosting sessions on that. And if they aren't, you can call one. You don't even have to be the expert. You can just say, hey, I am really interested in knowing how we can use OpenID Connect in the Internet of Things, and I don't know anything about it. Please come and teach me. People will come and run your session for you. So that's how IW works, and that's the kind of sessions that get held.
We had Kalia Young on the show a few episodes back, number 248 for those interested, and she kind of described this. She used the same word, the unconference, right? And I think I've seen pictures on the internet, of course, of people writing a topic and they just stick it up on a board. And then people either attach themselves to it or they say, it's like, go to this room if you're interested in this thing. Is it really like that, where people just really kind of congregate?
It's exactly like that. So every day we have a grid, right? And the grid is vertical columns, different session rooms, rows or different time slots. And you literally write your title and who you are on a big 8.5 by 11 piece of construction paper, stand up in opening circle, say, hey, I'm Phil Windley, and I want to host a session on the best guitar chords for Christmas songs. And then after opening circle is done, you go up to the wall and say, I want to be in this time slot, and in this room. You put a sticker on there to say what room you're going to be in. And then you go to that room at that time and have your session. So yeah, it's exactly like that.
I wonder if we can put like a card up there, Jim. It's like, hey, Identity at the Center. We want to record a podcast. Come into the room and get interviewed by us, or something like that.
If you guys come, I will find a room that you can use to set up and post a podcast, and grab as many guests as you want. So
okay, well now we're cooking. I think now you're speaking Jim and I's language. Okay. Well, yeah, let's talk about that, because I've never been to one, and I've always been, I'll be honest, intimidated to show up to something like that, because I feel like there's just these geniuses, right? You mentioned so many different specs and protocols and frameworks that have come out of this. Maybe they weren't created there, but I mean, you've basically named every single thing that's used in identity today has some sort of touch point with IIW. That's got to be really gratifying.
Yeah, it is. I mean, if I were to point to one thing I've done in my life that I think has had a huge impact, it'd probably be IIW. And, you know, I mean, frankly, I can't take tons of credit for it because I don't do much. I mean, you know, I make sure, you know, I charge people for their ticket prices, make sure the food vendors get paid, you know, rent the venue. But the content, right, really comes from all the people. We don't even do a program, right? We don't even have a program committee who decides what the topics are. That's all from the attendees. So it's really the attendees who make IIW what it is.
Wasn't that true? I think that's true for every conference, right? The more, I don't know, amenable attendees are to having those conversations. And this is the one thing I've really enjoyed about the identity space is everybody's just so gosh darn friendly. I mean,
well, and in fact, that's exactly why we do IIW the way we do, is because we think the best conversations at most conferences are the hallway conversations. Mm-hmm. And so we're trying to do a workshop where every session is a hallway conversation.
That's brilliant. That should be like part of the marketing or logo or something like that, because you're absolutely right. I mean, I've had some amazing hallway conversations that were, no offense to the conference, way better than the conference content, right? It's this dynamic conversation that takes place. I always point back to the example of Roger Grimes spending an hour with me at a table at Authenticate in, it would have been Seattle, talking about quantum computing. I mean, ridiculous conversation. And I'm like, okay, this is awesome.
See, in an IIW, you just call a session on that or sit at a table. We have lots of tables set out and lots of, I mean, I suspect that there are probably, 10 times the number of interesting conversations that happen as there are sessions. The last IIW, there were 162 sessions, about 320 participants. So, two participants per session. Obviously, it's spread out over time. So, it's not really just two people in each session. But it's a lot of sessions happen. Some of them are small. Some of them are big. I mean, we have rooms that'll hold, 60 people. We have rooms that'll hold 5. And
so you have a day job, it sounds like. You're also working with AWS Identity. What's your role over at AWS? I guess, what do you work on there? What's your day job? What's your like day-to-day like?
Yeah, so I am in AWS Identity, and I manage a team of developers working in the identity space. The most recent thing my team launched was I don't know if you're familiar with Amazon Verified Permissions. It's a fine-grained access control system based on the Cedar policy language. That launched in gated preview last June and then was generally available. Gated preview last November at reInvent, and it was generally available last June. My team launched a companion service to that allowed people who are also using AWS Cognito to use Cognito tokens as part of the authorization context for their authorization. So that's the kind of stuff we do. I'm very interested in authorization at this point. Somebody at IIW this last time, in closing circle, said that they thought that I'm paraphrasing, that authentication is mostly a solved problem, right? The FIDO and a few other things. I mean, we might mess around with FIDO at the edges, but pretty much it's unphishable. It's, challenge response. It works great. Yes, we probably aren't going to get a lot better than that, right? So what's the new thing? What's really interesting? What should people be focusing on? Authorization, right? I mean, when you think about it, authentication is really the simple thing. In the book, which I know we're going to talk about in a bit, but in the book, I give a definition of identity, which is Joe Andrews' definition, right? And he says that identity is how we recognize, remember, and respond to other people, places, things, whatever, right? So if you think about authentication, it's just about that first part, recognizing, right? So with authentication, we recognize people. But you still have to remember who this is. What are their attributes? What do I care about? You still have to respond to them, which often means saying what they can access and what they can't access. So, the big part of identity is really, I think, in the authorization piece. And that's where I'm focusing a lot of my time right now is on authorization.
And that's a really tough problem. I feel like a lot of organizations struggle with authorization issues. I remember Sarah Cicchetti had announced the Cedar kind of thing out there a while back. And this is not a topic that we've actually been able to touch on. For people who aren't familiar with Cedar, and we should probably do a whole episode on this separately.
Yeah, you should.
Yeah, what's Cedar in a nutshell?
Yeah, so Cedar is a policy language, right, that allows you to write policies. It is principal, action, resource, condition-based, like a lot of policy languages. It doesn't have loops, doesn't have recursion, so it's not Turing complete, right? You can't write programs in it. But you can say things like permit, users who are part of the resource owner group to make updates to any resource in the photo album, right? And so that's the kind of thing. But you also could add conditions to that. You could say if the time is between 8 a.m. in the morning and 5 p.m. at night, or those kinds of things. So you get this permission, action, resource triple, and then you also have conditions so that you can do attribute-based access control as well. Cedar comes with an evaluation engine that is open source on GitHub. There's a great tutorial at cedarpolicy.com that people can go and play with. Amazon Verified Permissions, which I mentioned a minute ago, is a hosted service that essentially runs Cedar for you. Makes it easy so you don't have to manage your own policy store and all of the things that services do, right? I mean, services are great at those kinds of things. So yeah, that's what Cedar is in AVP.
So Phil, you wrote a book called Learning Digital Identity under O'Reilly Publishing. O'Reilly Publishing, whenever I think of those books, I think of the animals on the cover. Yeah. And there's an animal on your cover, and I'm wondering, what is that animal and how did it get there?
Yeah, so it's a Nanking night heron, and it's from Australia. And one of the things that is true about O'Reilly books is authors don't get consulted about which animals go on the cover. So you don't get to pick, right? So it's not like the Nanking night heron is my spirit animal or anything. However, there's a colophon in the back of the book that talks about it. And one of the things I think is really interesting is it says that the night raven in ancient Greek, which is what the Greek name for the bird is, was used to describe birds of ill omen. So I'm not sure why a bird of ill omen is on the front of my book, but yeah, there it is.
There it is. So is this the first book you wrote? You mentioned that you wrote a book in, what was it, 05 or 06?
2005.
So in 2005,
O'Reilly,
under O'Reilly, was it the same bird, the night heron?
No, at that point, they had different series, and so digital identity was classified in their security series. And so they were doing old, I guess, woodcuts or something from like the medieval time period. And so I've got some woman on the front of the book. I don't know. I don't remember what the significance of that was. And then I wrote another book in 2012 on event processing. So not digital identity.
And did that have an animal?
No, it was not for O'Reilly. It was a Cengage book. So
gotcha.
Yeah, I did get to design that cover. Actually, I had a friend of mine design it, but yeah.
So I found I forget how I got turned onto the book, but I was like, okay, I'm going to order this. And I was expecting it to be digital identity for dummies. It's definitely not digital identity for dummies. It's thick. It's meaty. The text is not huge. There's a lot in there. Who's the book for? So our podcast, I tell you, is for the IAM practitioner. People who are taking all these great ideas and putting them into work in the real world. And, I think that describes a lot of us, right? You do that on your day job. Who is the book for?
Yeah, so I think that matches, right? I wrote the book for IAM practitioners. My hope was, not to be an introductory book, although I certainly think people do read it as an introductory book, but to be a complete kind of almost umbrella over the field of digital identity. Because I think too often IAM practitioners, there's a lot of books, fine books, right, for the purpose that they are trying to solve, for the problems they're trying to solve, that are kind of aimed at, here's how you use OpenID Connect to authenticate users on your application, right? And there'll be a great big book about lots of, very meaty, lots of code examples, that sort of thing. This book does not have specific code examples, right? This book is not going to tell you how to use OpenID Connect in your, Java application to, do whatever. It's trying to teach you about what the field of digital identity is from a holistic standpoint. So it starts off, like we just talked about, with a definition of digital identity. It talks about why digital identity is hard. It introduces Kim Cameron's laws of digital identity, which if you're an identity professional and you don't know Kim's laws, then you really ought to learn Kim's laws, because they tell you why identity systems so often fall short. That doesn't mean they're bad, right? Because often identity systems are built for a specific purpose. They might not fall short in terms of the specific purpose, but what happens then is somebody says, product manager somewhere says, we should, let our users, add, yellow buttons to this part or whatever. And identity people go, oh no, we can't do that. That isn't going to work. We can't support that. Or, that'll take 6 months of work before we can support. And that's because, the identity system was built for a specific purpose. And like I said, that's fine. That's how things work. But the laws of identity try to get you to think about identity more holistically. And then, the book kind of goes into some general topics, things like trust, privacy, those kinds of things. And then we get into some specific things like, how does authentication work? And I do talk about OpenID Connect, and I do talk about FIDO and some specific technologies, but like I said, not in a way that, is here's how you use FIDO in your application, more about why would you think about using FIDO instead of OpenID Connect? Or why would OpenID Connect be a good thing to use in certain circumstances? And I try to go back as often as possible to the laws, right? And talk about why this specific technology, which laws is it trying to meet and which laws does it not meet? And is that okay for your application? Right? We talk about authorization, talk about federated ID, and how federated identity works. And then probably the last third of the book or so, I get into what I think is the next frontier of identity, which is, I use the term self-sovereign identity. Some people say decentralized identity. I am very opinionated about this. I like the term self-sovereign identity because I can imagine decentralized identity systems which don't give the user control over their data and identifiers. Self-sovereign very clearly puts a stake in the ground and says the user has to have control over this. And that's why I like it. And so the last third of the book really talks about the technologies and protocols for doing self-sovereign or decentralized identity, things like DIDCOM, verifiable credentials, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I have to follow up on what you're talking about with the laws of identity. So Kim's laws, I remember I was at Digital ID World in 2005, right? And it was like when these things were brand new, and I was as green can be to the industry. Are they still relevant? This is 18 years ago.
That's I think what is so interesting about them, and why I think they deserve the word laws. Right? They're not laws in the sense of legal laws. They're not laws in the sense of the laws of physics, right? But they are laws in the sense of they describe big enough concepts in general enough terms to still be specific enough to be useful, but to not go out of date. And I think that's one of the things that makes them laws. And I believe they're still extremely useful. There are things like user control and consent, right? And Kim makes a stand on how digital identity systems should enable user control and consent. So you can ask yourself a question: does the identity system I'm using enable user control and consent, or to what extent does it enable user control and consent? And is that okay? Minimal disclosure for constrained use is another one. I mean, that's kind of timeless, right? I mean, that's the kind of thing. I mean, identity systems which haven't respected minimal disclosure for constrained use is what's gotten us into the whole privacy debacle that we're in now, right? With people worried about AI. I mean, how does digital identity relate to artificial intelligence? I think artificial intelligence without a good self-sovereign identity system is just a disaster waiting to happen, right? So Kim's laws, I think, are still very, very relevant.
I think, as you were saying that, I'm like, one of the things that attracted me to the identity space was going to those early conferences and seeing this isn't just technology ones and zeros and how to plug this in to make it work with that. There's a philosophical layer that
there is.
It's always just beneath the surface of everything. And maybe AI is like the next industry where that can happen, because it seems like every other kind of industry within IT kind of gets boring and just gets commoditized. Like I originally entered the space coming from the network engineering side of the house, and it's like everything that I used to do got commoditized in terms of like data centers all just got outsourced. Like nobody physically run servers anymore. I mean, I'm sure some people do, but it's certainly shrunken down in terms of the overall population of IT professionals. But yeah, back to the book. One of the things that blew me away, like again, I was like kind of expecting digital ID for dummies, not saying that in any kind of insulting way. I think those books are fantastic.
Sure.
But what I also saw was like, this is like an encyclopedia. And I'm wondering, like, how does one person know all this? So did you write the whole thing yourself, or did you have like sub-authors, or how does that work?
I wrote the whole thing myself. I mean, that doesn't mean that all of the ideas are mine. I mean, I've gone to, 37 IIWs. One of the things, I write a blog at windley.com, my name. And one of the reasons I write is, I tell people I write for me, right? I write so that I can understand ideas and get them in my head. If they happen to be useful to other people, that's great. But, I like to write them down because it's how I process information and how I come to understand things. So, some of the things in the book actually came from my blog, obviously, modified, edited, expanded, that sort of thing. But yeah, I just kind of collect this stuff. And, I originally, like we discussed, I wrote a book in 2005. My original idea was to write a second edition. And I've been meaning to write a second edition of Digital Identity for probably 12 years now, since 2010 or so. And, I've held several sessions at IIW saying, hey, if I'm going to redo this, what should I put in it? People always gave me ideas. And then, the whole self-sovereign identity thing happened, and I knew I wanted to do a book that included that. But I also wanted to not just do a book on self-sovereign identity. I wanted to do a book that was, covered digital identity from, start to finish, and kind of had, like you mentioned, a kind of a philosophical base to it. One of the things I like to say is that digital identity isn't about identity. It's about relationships. People build identity systems to manage relationships, not to manage identities. The identities are just the things they need to put in them in order to create the relationship. And so I wanted to include all of that in the book. And so I started putting together a table of contents, which if you ever written a book, that's like the first thing you do, right? Is you write a book proposal that includes a detailed table of contents. And, when I sent it to O'Reilly, they said, wow, this is great, but this is way too different to be a second edition. So it's going to be a new book. I said, okay. So it's a new book.
How do you suggest someone read the book? Like, do you attack it from cover to cover, or do you?
Yeah.
Maybe I could say, here's what I did. I decided to attack it from page 1. I probably read the first 3 or 4 chapters, but then I got excited about different areas. I was like, I can't wait to get to this chapter. So I jumped ahead and read the chapters that I wanted.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that a lot of the chapters are standalone. So, for example, like I said, I lead a team in AWS Identity. Not all of them are identity experts, right? They're developers who came from different areas. I'll just point them at chapter, 11 and say, hey, you need to go read about authentication and how OpenID works. You can just go read chapter 11 and kind of understand authentication. Now, it's going to refer back to things. It's going to say, here's the definition of identity, and authentication is about recognizing people. It's going to do those things. It's going to refer back to the laws of identity. So you can probably pick out almost any chapter and just read it by itself without having read anything. That said, I think what you did is probably how I'd recommend people read the book is, certainly read probably the first 5 chapters. They're probably the chapters that lay out kind of my overall philosophy of how I approach identity and how I think about it. But then after that, if you're interested in, how does privacy work? Chapter 8 works great. Chapter 9 is kind of a general developer's intro to cryptography, right? I mean, it's not going to teach you to be a cryptographer. It's more, if you're doing identity, cryptography is everywhere. What do you have to know about cryptography in order to do it? So, you might go into the authentication chapter and get into some section and say, okay, and it says, we use digital signatures to validate the token. And you're going to say, what's a digital signature? Well, then go back to chapter 9 and read about digital signatures. So I think that's a perfectly valid way to read the book.
Yeah. And like I said, I'm giving my endorsement. Great book. How can people get their hands on the book? And is there an audio version?
There is not an audio version. But, you should suggest that to O'Reilly on their website, to go in and suggest, we need an audio version of this. So, I mean, obviously Amazon is a good way to do it. It's available on O'Reilly's site. If you're a member of O'Reilly's, I forget what they call it, Learning Center, you have access to the book. Ping Identity actually bought rights to the book to publish on their website, and you can go get chapters of the book. They're serializing, and I don't know what they're up to now, but Ping Identity has it on their website. So any of those are great ways to do it. Go to my blog and click on the link, and that'll take you to Amazon. So
we'll put links in the show notes so anybody can, grab a link and find the exact, place to go and purchase a book if that's what they're interested in. I kind of wonder, like, if you were not the person reading the audio book, who would you choose to read it?
Well, I'd pick you, Jim.
Oh, God, no. It would make it twice as long.
What else can I say? That's a good question.
Morgan Freeman is who came to my mind.
I think I'd pick Doc Searles. He has a great radio voice. He used to be in radio way back in the day. So yeah, I think he'd do great. I'd pick Doc.
All right, +1 for Doc. Okay, so now I wanted to talk more about what was it like to write the book? And so kind of broke this into a couple of questions. What was the hardest chapter for you to write?
Probably the intro and the last chapter. So the intro, I always wait till the end. So when I started writing, I pretty much wrote it in order. I started with chapter 2 and went on through, but I didn't write chapter 1. Partly because I think introductions are hard to write, especially before you've written the book, because you really want the intro to be an intro, right? You want it to talk about what the book's going to say. And so, I wait till I'm done and then I write that. And so chapter 1 is probably one of the hardest chapters. All of them involve a little bit of research. I mean, even now, somebody will talk about SAML, and I'll pick up my book and go look at the SAML section because I don't remember all that stuff out of my head, obviously. So there's a little bit of research in all of it. The last chapter, though, I think was also not difficult, but it was challenging because I wanted to talk about, my goal, right, I think digital identity is foundational to how we live our digital lives. In fact, I say that several times in the book, that without digital identity systems that respect individuals and their rights, we cannot expect to live effective online lives and have any degree of privacy. They'll always, don't get me wrong, I think the current world of the internet is actually amazing, but it's like living in Disneyland in the sense that it's all curated, right? It's all these experiences that Google put together for you or Apple put together for you or whatever. And you really aren't having a authentic human experience where you connect with people. And I like to use the example of going to a convenience store, right? If we put a convenience store online, you would have to actually have relationships with like the coffee maker and the people in line with you. And, you'd have to exchange identifiers or maybe the convenience store would have a login system. You had to log in so that you could even talk to the other people in line. That's what it would be like. That's not authentic. That's not how humans live. So I'm ranting, as you can tell, but if you want to live effective digital lives, we have to have identity systems that respect human rights, human privacy, give people control over their identifiers, over the data that those identifiers will link to. And so I wanted to end the book in a way that helped digital identity practitioners understand that they were building the future. And the future was what they decided it was going to be, right? The future is not preordained. It is based on what we build as practitioners. And we can say, oh, but Google, Apple, blah, blah, blah. But we all build it, right? We go to work for them. We decide what kind of systems we're going to build. We decide what kind of systems we're going to advocate for. And if we advocate for systems that help people live good digital online lives, then we've built something great. And we have built a future that is worth living in. I think I close with a quote by Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote the book on surveillance capitalism. And I can't remember her exact question, but it's something like, is the future, is the digital future one we want to live in? And my answer is a hearty yes, so long as digital identity practitioners build the future they want to live in, not the future they want to avoid. So anyway, that's my spiel. And so I wanted to write the last chapter in a way that led people to that and helped them feel a sense of purpose and responsibility for the digital future. And whether it succeeded or not, I don't know, but that's what I wanted to do. So it was a challenging chapter to write.
Yeah, no, that's, and I think the whole introduction made a lot of sense to me because writing it at the end probably makes the most sense. But I also like that you brought up Surveillance Capitalism, another great book for all of our listeners. If you're looking for that reading list for 2024, that's a good one to put on the list. I'm wondering, Phil, so with how much is in here, and I'm sure when you sent the outline over to the O'Reilly people, they're probably not only is this a separate book, but this is an epic. Especially if you did your day job while you're writing the book. Yeah. So did you take a hiatus in order to write the book, or did you just do it at night?
I didn't. I wrote it mostly at night and on weekends. Thanks to my wife Lynn for putting up with all of that. But yeah, it was. I wrote it in about a year, and do you have an editor? And, I try to be nice to my editors and give them their chapters when I've promised them. And they do give you a schedule, right? They say, okay, we want half of the chapters turned in by this date. We want, another quarter turned in by this date, so on. So I tried to make their schedule and got it done.
So did as you're going, did much of what you were working on end up on the cutting room floor? I mean, it seems like that, you look at something that's written, not just the 20 pages that made it, it's all of the editing and everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mentioned I had an editor, and I actually love working with editors. Some people don't. They don't like having their work criticized or whatever. I love that someone is going to spend their time making me look smart. And that's what editors do, right? They make your writing look good. They tell you when things don't make sense and when you need to clarify something. So I don't know how much ended up on the cutting room floor, but I will tell you that lots of stuff changed as we went into the editing process, moved things around. She'd ask questions, I'd add a new section, I'd move a section, I'd completely redo a description, that kind of thing. So the editing definitely changed the book, and for the better.
Oh, that's really cool. So what is it, Phil, about the book or about the experience of writing the book or whatever that you're most proud of?
Well, I mean, I feel like I accomplished the goal that I set out to, which we just discussed, right? Getting people to the end of the book with a call to action, with a feeling that they understood the world of digital identity, that they knew how important it was, that they knew the concepts and the underlying technologies, and could then go out and say, okay, I know that we should be doing it this way, or we need to work on minimizing the information we ask users for, whatever that is. That's what I hope they do, and I think the book gets there. Whether people agree with me or not on that, I don't know. But that's, I think that's where the book got to, and I hope that's, what people get out of it.
Yeah, I think it was definitely the opportunity to get that and probably introduce a lot of people to some of these concepts who haven't been in the industry as long as you have. Last question about this is, you talked about the second edition of the first book. Will there be a second edition of this one? And if you were to write a second edition, what would be different?
Yeah, so if I were to write a second edition right now, obviously it's only, less than a year old, so I probably wouldn't change the structure too much. But I mean, if you look at my blog, you'll see all of the stuff I've written about since the book came out is stuff that likely I would think about adding. So, I've got, even just, most recent things. I mean, things like permissionless and one-to-one, computing at the edge. Those are all topics that I think zero data, zero trust. I mean, I don't even mention the word zero trust in the book. And yet that's, I think a huge topic that people care about. As I've gotten more into authorization, that's clearly one of the use cases for authorization is zero trust. So those are things that, now I go, my word, why didn't I think about zero trust and put that in the book? But, at the time, it wasn't in my radar. So yeah, there are plenty of things I would add. Don't know that I'd cut much. Not yet anyway, but, some of the chapters, if you look at the first Digital Identity, the first book I wrote, and look at the chapters, you'll see there are chapters that have essentially the same title. And, some of the sections sound similar, but, they're largely rewritten. Like in the chapter on authorization, I do talk about mandatory access control and discretionary access control. Those are things I just lifted from the first book and rewrote. But yeah, so I don't know that I'd drop much, but if you ask me in 5 years, there's probably stuff that I'd say, oh, nobody cares about that anymore.
I feel like this is the space of identity, right? There's always something coming and going.
Like I mentioned earlier, right? I mean, we started IIW literally with the idea. We all had things we wanted to work on. Doc was interested in personal data. I was interested in reputation systems. And we thought, we'll solve this identity problem, then we'll go off and work on the things that we care about. And we're now, in April, we're going to hold the 38th edition of IAW, and it's always fresh. It's always got new topics. It's like this identity is this evergreen topic because we're constantly learning new things about it and, expanding what we think is important.
Is there a new topic or topic du jour that you've seen really kind of take hold in, let's say, the last 6 months, maybe the last 2 or 3 IIWs? Is there something that's like, wow, this is starting to catch fire?
Well, I mentioned one, authorization. I think authorization is a big topic that people are starting to pay much more attention to than they have in the past. The other one that has clearly been a topic of conversation at IIW for probably the last 4 years has been self-sovereign identity, digital identity, protocols like DITCOM, systems like verifiable credentials. How do we make those work? What's user uptake? How do we get adoption for those? So yeah, that's been a huge topic. I mean, IIW has in some ways been ground zero for that topic over the last few years. So yeah, those are big.
I want to pick your brain on sort of identity itself and from an innovation standpoint. What do you think is the most, important identity thing that's come into play recently? Like, let's say within the last maybe year or two.
I would probably pick decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials. Decentralized identifiers, especially the peer did method, change how identifiers work in some fundamental ways. And the most important way is that decentralized identifiers, like I said, especially peer dids, are meant to be controlled by people in wallets. And that is, if you think about what I was saying earlier about why, what's it going to take for us to lead effective online lives? That idea, right? I think the biggest thing standing in the way, and this is going to go to Jim's philosophical bent, is we are not digitally embodied. Because we've got video, I can see you kind of squinting a little bit. What does Phil mean by that?
What I mean.
What I mean is, if you think about, obviously anybody could stand up a website, right? I mean, there's nothing stopping my mom from standing up a website, but she's not going to, right? I mean, and so who are the things online, or what are the things online that we think about as being the places we go? Well, they're all things run by companies, and most of them are run with what I term intervening administrative authorities, meaning that the identity administrator is sitting between you and whatever you want to do, right? They're intervening in this interaction, right? We don't have any place to stand in the online world. The browser isn't it, right? The browser is client server. It's a client to the server. Server is making all the decisions. The client is just echoing whatever the server tells it to. Right? What is it going to take for us to be embodied, to have something where we are online, where you and I can exchange messages without any intervening system, right? Well, what I think it takes what people are calling digital wallets. And so, what do I think is the most exciting, interesting digital identity thing right now? Digital wallets, and how digital wallets allow us to create peer identifiers, exchange those peer identifiers, exchange trust information with each other, verifiable credentials, and essentially be the masters of our own system, right? And, phones, the things that we carry around in our pocket, give us platforms that we can use those digital wallets in. And I think that is the most important and exciting thing that is coming along right now.
All right. Last question before we start to wrap things up with a lighter note. Where do you see AI taking identity in the next 5 years?
Yeah. So I think that, I think I said earlier, AI without a good self-sovereign identity basis is pretty scary. What's fake? What's not? Who created what? Who didn't? Are you really you, or are you a fake you? How do I know that you're really you? How do I know that you're human? How do I guarantee that you're human? Well, I mean, think about just that question. How do I guarantee you're human? Or how do I know that you're human? And now think about how we do that. This is 2023. You go to open up a new bank account. How do they do it? They do like a Zoom call with you and have you hold up your driver's license in the call with them. I mean, my word. This is like Stone Age technology compared to what
Neanderthals,
what we could do, right? And so in order for us to coexist with AI, I think we have to be able to prove online that we're human. We have to have clear ways of knowing when we're interacting with an AI and when we're not. That is all going to be based on self-sovereign identity systems. I don't know that it's actually going to be DIDCOM and the verifiable credential spec, but it's going to be something like them. Right? It's going to be something where I have identifiers that I control in my wallet and can prove that I'm human without having to hold up my driver's license in a Zoom call to you. That's where I think AI takes identity. I think it drives this need for self-sovereign identity even further than it has been.
I know we're running long, but I just have to ask two more questions here. We talk about self-sovereign identity, and I put a poll out recently on one of our episodes because we had a conversation around blockchain on the identity side of things. And basically the poll question was, who would you trust to run your decentralized identity platform? And I think that's going to be a problem for adoption is who does run, this decentral platform? Is it the government? Is it education? Is it healthcare? I mean, given where we're at today politically in the US, if the government does it, 50% of the population is immediately out.
Yeah.
Like, who do we trust to have this data?
First of all, I would say it doesn't need to be a blockchain. And there are lots of ways to decentralize identity and create self-sovereign identity systems that don't necessarily require somebody to run something. So, for example, with peer DIDs, we can all create whatever DIDs we want. You and I can exchange them. We can all, vouch for each other. We could create reputation systems. None of that requires any kind of platform at all. Now, that doesn't mean I don't believe we won't get benefit out of a platform. So, for example, if I want my driver's license as a credential that I hold in my wallet, there needs to be something that can tell me that driver's license really came from the state of Virginia and not from, I did just make it myself. How's that going to work? Right. So there's kind of a new term that people are floating around called acceptance networks. We could probably do a whole show on just acceptance networks, but that's essentially, I think, what it's going to take. It's not going to be a company, right? It can't be a company. It has to be a protocol, a governance model. It has to have lots of people who have bought off on it. And there can be more than one acceptance network. There doesn't have to be one. When I say acceptance network, the best example we have of acceptance networks are Visa and MasterCard and American Express. I mean, they're all acceptance networks. They have governance, they have technology, they have protocols, they have processes, and all of those things make it so that I can walk into a merchant in London, slap down a little piece of plastic, and that merchant is almost guaranteed that they're going to get paid. That's magic. Why does it work? Well, it works because governance, process, protocol, technology have all come together to solve that problem. That's what we need. We need that sort of thing. It shouldn't be run by the government. Shouldn't be run by a single company, but we're going to have something like that, maybe multiple somethings like that. And, we'll decide which ones we want to use based on where we want to do business. So.
All right. Final question. Go back to AI because I just have to. How do you see that impacting your book writing process in the future?
Well, it's interesting. So I have tried to incorporate generative AI in multiple places in my life. So I use AI like a virtual assistant. I don't like to just ask it to write sections because I think it produces text, which at least at this point, you can still kind of tell it wasn't written by me, at least, because I have a certain writing style. And even if you say, use the style of Technometria blog to do this, it still doesn't write. So what I do is I ask it questions. So I I don't know. I mean, one of my favorite books, and there's a whole backstory to this. One of my favorite books is a book called Snow Crash. And in Snow Crash, the protagonist, who is named hero protagonist, uses this AI called the librarian. And Neil Stephenson wrote this book like in 2004, something like that. No, 1994. I mean, long ago, right? And if you go read the dialogue that hero has with the librarian, that's what you should be doing with ChatGPT, right? So I'll ask ChatGPT something like, tell me how this particular company enables zero trust or what their product does to. And then I'll say, okay, but what about this? Do they, and so I'll ask it for information. Now, you have to kind of take it with a grain of salt because, as Johannes Stern says, these are large language models, not large fact models. So you have to know enough about the subject to be a good interrogator. But I use it, I interrogate it all the time. In fact, I am giving all of my kids, I have 5, giving all of my kids a $250 gift certificate and an instruction sheet on how, and I'm expecting them to use the $250 to subscribe to ChatGPT for 1 year. It's because you do get some benefits from subscribing and to incorporate it into their lives. So that's how important I think it is. I want all of my kids to know about it, and that's my Christmas gift to them.
I think that's cool. I'm a ChatGPT subscriber, and I've built, I think, 3 or 4 different specific models for different types of use cases. And
that's one of the things you can do as a subscriber that you can't as a non-subscriber. And I agree with you. That's really important.
And I think it's a good way to learn it, but it's also really interesting to see how the technology is evolving literally right before your eyes.
Yeah.
And it's the ultimate low code experience, right? Tell me this, do this, and you see it take shape in front of you.
It literally feels like the web in 1994.
But with better graphics.
With better graphics.
All right, let's end on a layer note. This is definitely one of our longer episodes, but I've really enjoyed this conversation. Before we started talking, we were talking about hobbies, and you mentioned that you're into bicycles. And I said, okay, well, what kind of bicycles? And then you started rattling off a bunch of bicycles.
Yeah.
Road, gravel,
so I've got
electric commuter.
I've got a specialized Robay, which is a road bike. I've got a Cannondale Quick CR1, which is kind of a gravel bike. I've turned it into a gravel bike. I've got a Trek Super Commuter Plus 8 that is I use it for commuting, but it's an electric bike. I also use it for longer rides, like on bike trails and stuff. And then I've got an electric bike, mountain bike, which is a specialized, now I'm going to forget the name of it. Anyway, all great bikes. I love all of them. I can't part with any of my babies.
Why do you need 4 bicycles?
Well, it kind of depends on the mood you're in, right? I mean, sometimes I want to go out on a trail, and so I take the mountain bike. Sometimes I'll take the gravel bike if I'm, feeling especially spry. I've kind of, I'm more prone to take the electric bikes nowadays. I have to admit. I find that it is true that the electric bike is less work. My running theory is that, and I have some data to back this up, is that on a mile per mile basis, you're doing 65 to 70% of the effort on the electric bike. Of course, it depends on how high you have it dialed up, but doing 60 to 70% of the effort on the electric bike that you do on a non-electric bike. But on an hour by hour basis, it's exactly the same, right? So on an hour by hour basis, I'm burning the same amount of calories according to my calorie tracker. I'm, feel the same kind of tiredness. And so what that means is the electric bike allows you to do more in an hour than you could have with a non-electric bike, which means you get to have more fun, right? You can go further. You can see more places. So I do find myself tending more towards the electric bike these days.
All right. Bonus lighter note. Jim picked up on this fact when reading the book that you might be a Jackson Browne fan. And so, Jim, you want to ask the Jackson Browne question?
Yes, I would. Tell us your favorite Jackson Browne song. But bonus to that, question 1A is, why are you a big Jackson Browne fan?
Yeah, so I'll answer the last question first. So I'm a Jackson Browne fan because I kind of came to him through the Eagles. So I'm also a huge Eagles fan. And Jackson Browne and the Eagles kind of intersect with each other. Jackson Browne and Glenn Frey were roommates and he wrote, now I'm going to forget. It's tough getting old. Anyway, he wrote one of the Eagles, hits. And so I kind of came to him through that, right? Started listening to his music. And I like it because he's very philosophical. So I'm going to pick a couple of probably less well-known songs as my favorites, even though I like them all. But I like Fountain of Sorrow. It's not as well-known, but it's about how friends and lovers kind of navigate through this kind of where they're at in their relationships, and it's called Fountain of Sorrows because this fountain of sorrow springs from your life like a fountain in a pool. That's the lyrics, right? And I just find his lyrics so interesting. The other bonus, which I almost no one has heard of, is Lawyers in Love, so go listen to it. Jackson Browne, Lawyers in Love. It's about the Soviet Union being turned into vacation land for lawyers in love. I don't know that there's deep philosophy there, but it's definitely entertaining. So
it's an interesting premise, I guess.
Yeah.
I always go back to Somebody's Baby, which was a song in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which it's got to rank within my top 5 movies of all time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the song's great. I mean, it's very lighthearted. It's not as philosophical as many others of his songs, but yeah.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap it up for this week. I know we spent some extra time here with you, Phil, but really appreciate it. I'm going to have links in our show notes. So phil.windley.org is your website. The book is called Learning Digital Identity. We'll have a link to that for Amazon for people to check that out. I guess try and find the Jackson Browne's Easter eggs maybe through it.
Yeah.
And then, we'll wrap it up for this week. You can find Jim and I on the web at idacpodcast.com or on Twitter at idacpodcasts, on Mastodon, speaking of self-sovereign / decentralized, at idacpodcast at infosec.exchange. And of course, you can connect with Jim and I on LinkedIn. And let us know, what you think of the episode, and subscribe, all that jazz. And Jim, anything you want to close with?
Yeah, I wanted to close with, we got a mention from Lindsay Dunn, who is somebody that I met at Octane this year. She's a identity consultant out of Germany, and she just mentioned, thank you, Jim McDonald and Jeff Steadman. Your podcast is the best. She was writing about the episode that we did with Jason Rebholz of Corvus Insurance, and just how much she had taken away. I mean, it was quite at the write-up. So I know you got tagged. You'll see it as well. But she just mentioned that our podcast is the best. So we'll just leave it at that.
I'm not going to argue with that. I mean, that's
Amen.
That's an opinion, and we'll take it as fact. How about that? So yeah, thanks for that. Stuff like that is cool when we see it out in the world, and keeps us going. So, all right, good mention. We'll go ahead and wrap it up for this week. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll talk with y'all in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com and find us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. See you next time on Identity at the Center.